Hello, everyone. In the last podcast, we talked about the general officers and the military industrial complex, the relationship amongst the retired generals and the various mentorship programs. So, in continuing with our series of podcasts on senior military leadership, today I want to talk about general accountability of general officers. Are we holding them to the same standards that we held past general officers after World War One and World War Two? So let's go back in history a little bit. The U.S. military came out of World War One with about 4 million military personnel. That came back from Europe. They fought in Europe. They did incredibly well under General Blackjack Pershing, and they came back to the United States and basically demobilized. And the U.S. military sort of weathered away. In the 1930s, the end strength was right around 150,000 personnel in the Army. And a lot of them were training with, wooden rifle. But then, when the storm clouds were on the horizon, President Roosevelt started building up the military and assigned General George C. Marshall as the chief of staff of the Army. And he is really the grandfather of the modern day military. So, and he was a straightforward, straight shooting general officer. And he didn't take fools lightly. He was known to relieve incompetent generals in a heartbeat. So, for example, he'd relieved over 600 generals, and also, their admirals also relieved at the time, over 600. 16 of the 150 division commanders were relieved. So when we go back and look at the history of the U.S. military, in World War II, there's some incredible generals that we can look back upon. Like General Marshall, obviously, that we just talked about. And there was, General Eisenhower, General Bradley, General Patton, General Ridgway, General MacArthur. So these were the great heroes, in my opinion. I'm sure somebody else has their own list, and that's fine. That sort of pioneered the U.S. military and guided us and led us through the combat of World War II. And so just give you an example, in World War II, what they expected of leaders. So on DDay Landings, on the first wave, there was a general officer. His name was Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Eventually, he received the Medal of Honor, and a month later, he died in France of a heart attack. And there was also a general by the name of Norman Cota. He was, the one that saved Omaha Beach. He was on the second wave, and when he landed, there was just chaos on the beach. The troops were hunkered down, and they were getting killed right on the beach. So he evidently said, we can either die on the beach or we can move inland and die inland. Rangers lead the way. And so he got people moving. He got them off the beach. And that's where the term Rangers lead the way came from General Norman Cota. So this was incredible combat leadership. And then you fast forward, 4 years later, the military again disbanded after World War II. And then Korea all of a sudden popped up. And so General Ridgway was sent to Korea. And the first 3 days, he did the leader's recon and started, flying over Korea, looking at the geography of it, the topography of the place, and found out that we were basically, instead of securing the ridge lines and the high ground, we were securing the low ground. The generals, the senior officers hadn't really done much. General Ridgway fired 5 of the 6 division commanders and 14 of the 19 regimental commanders, to the point where people from the Pentagon started calling him and saying, hey, people starting to ask a lot of questions about what you're doing. So you may want to throttle back and maybe do rotation, let some of these officers go rather than, firing them. And Ridgway, he was a taskmaster, having been brought up under General Marshall, and he didn't take any prisoners. And then obviously, then there's a political tension between President Truman and General MacArthur when General MacArthur was relieved. Then you fast forward to Vietnam. There were hardly any general officers that were relieved in Vietnam. They were promoted up. Westmoreland was promoted up. In World War II, out of 1,100 general officers that served, approximately 40 of them were killed in action. In Vietnam, we had one flag officer, general officer killed. Rear Admiral Robinson was killed in a helo crash. And then there was a whole new way of leading in Vietnam where senior officers, to include battalion commanders and regimental commanders and division commanders, started leading from helicopters. They would fly over the battle zone, the battle, and basically look down and give direction from there. So they removed themselves from combat. And consequently, we know what happened in Vietnam. I don't need to go into that. Then you fast forward to Desert Storm. General Schwarzkopf was probably the last true combat leader that we had. He was in country, leading from the front, and he was a force to reckon with. And consequently, the U.S. military did quite well in Desert Storm, not just because of him, because of all the equipment the U.S. military had. We were just light years ahead of Iraq in terms of leadership and also the equipment that we had. But unfortunately, we didn't finish Iraq back in 1990 as we should have. So that was a political decision, nonetheless. So we fast forward to Afghanistan and Iraq. It's almost a tragedy of the piss poor leadership that our general officers demonstrated during these two conflicts, and I'll talk about that. Now, I preface this with, I've got several generals are close friends of mine. I've served with a lot of them. So I've got incredible amount of respect for them. They're good guys, don't get me wrong, but they're not the right guys that we needed in combat at the time. Absent a few generals that led from the front in the heat of battle, most of them were removed from the battle. So for example, in Afghanistan, most of the generals were, sat hundreds of miles away from where the combat was actually taking place. The command operations centers were 2,500 miles away in another country, and they're monitoring events from there. You just can't fight a battle like that. You can't fight it from helicopters, from above the battlefield, or you can't fight it removed from the battlefield. You have to feel the heat of the battle. You have to be able to feel how the enemy is going to react based on the terrain. You have to feel how the troops are doing based on the amount of sleep that they have had, based on their morale. This stuff can't be done remotely. It's just impossible. And, firsthand experience, my higher command unit was over 100 miles away from where we were actually fighting, trying to give us direction, go left or go into this valley, go into that valley. They had no clue what was going on. In terms of tactically on the ground, the best people that knew what was going on were probably the platoon commanders and the squad leaders and the company commander. And rather than being removed, as a battalion commander, being removed from the fight, I used to travel with the main effort, because to me, that was where I belonged, because I could decisively engage in the battle, through the air support that I had available that I could bring into the battle and turn the battle one way or the other. And then my executive officer would be with the supporting effort, and the sergeant major would be with the second supporting effort. So I had a very small CP myself, my OPSO, my air officer, a radio operator, and a machine gunner. I drove my own Humvee because I knew where I was going. I know Afghanistan fairly well. So that's how we operated. Now, there are other battalion commanders that were removed. That was their choice. But they were fighting back from the CPs, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers away. And, because that's how their generals were doing it. So they thought that was appropriate. In my mind, that's highly inappropriate. Commanders need to be up front, leading from the front. That's where you belong. So nonetheless, we got into Afghanistan, and things didn't really quite turn out well for us in Afghanistan or Iraq. Not a single general officer was relieved for incompetence. Not one. There's one general officer that died in Afghanistan. Major General Harold Green. He was inspecting some training evolution with the Afghan National Army, and that when an Afghan opened fire on them. So it wasn't really in combat, but he was in a combat situation nonetheless. And the reason for this is because the generals were far removed. They weren't exposing themselves, to the battle, that our young Marines were. And a side note, there were a lot of officers, battalion commanders and above, that used to have PSDs, personal security detail, that would travel around with them. Basically, a bunch of bodyguards traveling around with the commanders. And I just found that to be just an abomination, quite frankly, because, that young lance corporal, the PFC, doesn't have a PSD detail protecting him. So why does a battalion commander or above rate a PSD? I never had one. My PSD was with the main effort. A reinforced rifle company of Marines is probably the best security detail you can get. And they did fantastic. Commander has to be up front in the battle. So, let's talk about, accountability. Is there a double standard in the military? I would venture to say, if you ask any enlisted person, is there a double standard between officers and enlisted? And the answer would resoundingly be, yes, there is. Okay? And I'm here to tell you, within the officer corps, there's also a double standard. Generals are treated far differently. They're held to a different standard. They're allowed to make some mistakes that others would get thrown in the brig for. For example, if a PFC or lance corporal loses a weapon, he's toast. Okay? But if a general lies and covers up something, nothing happens to him. He retires in grade. Look at all the generals that were changed out. We had, General McKernan was changed out in Afghanistan by President Obama, retired at 4-star rank. General McChrystal, for insubordination, retired at 4-star rank. General Petraeus, we know what he was involved in, retired 4-star rank. General Allen, retired at 4-star rank. So these guys, and then the Kabul debacle, General McKenzie, retired at the 4-star rank. So, yeah, one can say, yeah, they're held accountable, but they retire at the 4-star rank and they get a pension of $200,000 a year. And then, like in the last podcast that we talked about, they get this massive package from the military-industrial complex. And that's exactly what's happening. And the reason it's happening is because there's no accountability in the DoD. And next podcast, we're going to talk about accountability. Okay? And the reason is it's a culture of tolerance, of ineptness, and no accountability. And what do I mean by that? Well, Pentagon failed 6 audits in a row. If any corporation had done that, people would be getting fired left and right. But we tolerate that, and it's okay, right? 6 audits. And the same thing applies here. Now, if you go back to 2004, when a great American hero, Pat Tillman, was killed in Afghanistan, I happened to be there, not during the incident, but at the same time, it was covered up by general officers. They lied. They didn't want to tell the truth, exactly what happened. So they lied to the family, they lied to the American people. And not a single general was held accountable for lying. And then you look back further, there's another incident where there's a general in the Marine Corps. He's on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a commandant in the Marine Corps. He lied. He undue command influence. Inspector General came out and said, yeah, this guy used undue command influence. So what happened to him? Allowed to retire at 4-star rank, $200,000 a year. Unacceptable. Why weren't these people called back to active duty and held accountable? We would certainly do that to a young Marine or a young soldier or a young officer. It seems to me it's only lieutenant colonels and below are the ones that are held accountable for incompetence. The same general who was a commandant of the Marine Corps lied on his qualifications. He claimed that he went to the basic school. He attended the basic school. Now, to an average person, when you say you attended the basic school, that means you went to the basic school for 6 months where they teach you how to be an officer. Well, come to find out, when this guy's retiring, the truth comes out, he never went to the basic school. So then they come out with the story, well, he took the Marine correspondence course for the basic school. That's a lie. It's an integrity violation. So if we're not going to hold ourselves accountable and we're not going to hold ourselves to the highest standard of integrity, then what's the point? And going back to General Marshall in World War II, that created this modern army, he wouldn't have tolerated any of this. So we need to get back to our roots and have one standard for everybody. And the general officers need to be held to a higher standard of that standard because they're the generals. And if we don't hold these generals to the higher standards, then how do we expect our troops to be held to a higher standard? And then we have a retention and a recruiting problem. So at the end of the day, we got to clean up ourselves first. And we have to have one standard that applies to everybody in the military. And that, my friends, is going to help us improve, because we can have all the gizmos, all the fancy equipment, but if we don't have the right leadership that's held accountable and is honest to the American public and to those that they lead, we'll never be successful. Okay, that's all I got. Stay rugged. Khan out.